All right, so this is the second part of Chapter 7. We're going to be looking at species interactions and how that affects biodiversity and populations. We're going to kind of fly through this presentation because we've really covered it quite a bit already in our Chapter 7 book review questions. So yeah, the goal for this lecture is to be able to explain how interactions between organisms help drive natural selection. You'll have 4 quick thinks throughout the presentation to answer, and you'll turn those in at the end of the day. First big idea is species interactions affect the resource use and sizes of other populations in an area. Everything is interconnected, and we'll see why when we look at these interactions. All right, so looking at species interactions, there are really 3 main types of interactions. There's this first and most common, which is competition, where 2 species are competing for the same resource. There's predation, in which one is a predator and one's prey, predator-prey interaction. And then the other is symbiosis, in which they're interacting, and how depends on the type of symbiotic relationship they have. So why do we study species interactions? Well, first, because they have a significant impact on the populations involved and really the whole ecosystem. Second, because these interactions are what drive natural selection. They really influence who survives and is able to reproduce. So basically it determines who is indeed the fittest within an ecosystem or between species. All right, so the first type of interaction we're going to look at is competition, where 2 animals are competing for the same resource. There are 2 types of competition. There's interspecific competition, which is 2 different types of animals competing for the resource. And then there's intraspecific competition, in which members of the same species are competing for the same resource. And here's your first quick think question of the day. Make a list of resources that species might compete for. All right, so think in the Northwest, what are some resources that humans or other animals compete for? Think natural resources. So let's kind of zoom in on intraspecific competition. Again, that's competition amongst animals of the same species, where they're oftentimes in this intraspecific competition, they're fighting to win the resource. And it can be really intense, like these bears here fighting, likely for salmon and territory, or in our activity we did last week, the wolves would oftentimes fight for also territory and essentially to get the moose as their prey. All right, interspecific competition usually doesn't involve fighting. It's just a matter of getting better at getting the resource than the other. So these zebras and the elephants here both foraging, but since they are different species, they often have slightly different niches, which means less fighting for that specific resource. Okay, so unfortunately for those that do occupy the same niche, there's something known as the competitive exclusion principle, in which case no 2 species it's possible for them to occupy the exact same niche, because inevitably there will be so much competition for the resource that it would be too intense for both to survive. One species will inevitably be better at getting that resource, and the other then has to either migrate, adapt, or die, which I call the MAD principle. So how do animals get around this competitive exclusion principle? Well, they certainly don't do it in one generation, because they're not able to adapt within one generation. But some species, like these warblers here, which have now speciated, the warblers used to all occupy the same niche here, where they would feed or forage on things within the same area or throughout the tree. And over time, different species of warbler that survived were those that maybe, like this Blackburnian warbler, it survived and was able to reproduce, and its offspring survived as well if they were foraging a little higher up on the tree than, say, this bay-breasted warbler. And the Cape May warblers did even better if they foraged higher up, and over time they partitioned this particular resource here. So each species niche was just a little bit smaller, and they were able to survive because they weren't competing within the same area as another species of warbler. So this is called resource partitioning. It's a way of getting around the competitive exclusion principle. And essentially here, if these were the warblers, two types of warblers foraging in the same area, they have this large overlap in their feeding habits. So they have a lot of competition there because their niche is too broad here. So over time, their niche got smaller. They only fed in one area of their tree, and that led them to not be competing. It's called divergence here. They get smaller niche and spread apart. This sometimes also happens not with necessarily different ways, but sometimes different times of feeding or in different places, like with the warblers. So like owls and hawks, for example, both feed on mice, but one feeds at night, and the owls, and one during the day, like the hawks. All right, so your second quick think, I want you to think about humans now as animals, and are we also subject to the principle of competitive exclusion? I want you to answer that question. So you're going to have to answer it and also defend your answer. Explain why you think either humans are subject to it or are not. So here we've got some fishermen with a huge catch over there, obviously using a lot of a resource, and then also some human impact in the form of habitat fragmentation, where we're using this other resource, the timber there, or the trees, and logging that resource. So I'm going to help answer that last quick think question for you. I believe that yes, humans are indeed subject to the principle of competitive exclusion because our use of resources directly competes with other species or organisms and forces them to leave the area or go extinct in that area. For instance, here with the fishermen, if you were a larger animal or a predator of those same fish, you're getting outcompeted by these fishermen, and you either must somehow leave the area or you're going to go extinct because adaptation doesn't take place quickly enough to be able to meet the change in the environment that we're creating. The fish that eat these fish can't possibly adapt fast enough to learn new behaviors or anything like that. Remember, adaptation takes many generations. Okay, so the next type of interaction we're going to talk about is predator-prey interactions or predation. Inevitably, all consumers feed on other organisms, whether they're plant organisms or plant species like herbivores feed on, or whether they're other animals like carnivores, or whether they're more generalists and feed on both. So predator-prey relationships result in changes in at least one of the populations, which then results in changes in the other. So how do the changes in population size affect ecosystems? Well, a change in the size of one population indeed affects the size of the other population, which, because of the web of life, everything is connected. So if just this Canadian lynx here and this hare are affected, so too whatever the hare is eating will be affected, and therefore whatever is eating what the hare is eating as well will be affected. So it's an ecosystem-wide influence, not just between these two particular populations. We studied a couple predator-prey interactions last week when we looked at the moose and the wolves on Isle Royale in Michigan there, where we saw as the moose numbers increased, so too the wolves numbers increased. And then we later looked at the fir trees and tried to make a correlation there. Sometimes it's hard to tell which population is affecting the other. So was it the hare here that's affecting the number of lynx, or vice versa, is the number of lynx affecting the hare? Or maybe the two of them are affecting each other, and that's what scientists thought forever. But more recently, they've done more research that turns out that there's a couple things that's affecting the hare population. It's not just the number of lynx, but it's also the availability of the hare's food too. So what it's eating. It's always more complex than it seems. All right, so thinking about predator-prey interactions, it's always a good thing to look at adaptations and strategies that help predators survive and also help prey survive. So we're going to look at some of those specialized adaptations. The first predator advantage is structural advantages. So they have weapons are fangs and claws, flexible bodies, larger sizes. They might be speedier or have great eyesight. We're going to talk about some more of those. Besides structural adaptations, predators also have behavioral adaptations that allow them to catch their prey. For instance, they might stalk their victim or have specialized venom. Most fish have what's called a gape and suck mechanism, which allows them to kind of gape their mouths open like so, and create a negative pressure so that the fish, little fish here that it's eating, gets sucked into its mouth like a vacuum and swallowed whole. Pretty cool mechanism. And then, of course, the behavioral adaptation here, it seems like keen eyesight isn't a behavior, but sure enough, being able to develop and hone in that instinct is important for these predators. Another predator strategy is their speed and their intelligence. So the more intelligent they are, the easier it is going to be to catch their prey. Obviously, the faster they can run, they can catch their prey. Some of them hunt in packs. They have specialized paws here, like bobcats and lynx do, to run in the snow, or like the wolves did compared to the moose. It's a lot easier to catch your prey if your prey doesn't see you first, so camouflage is important as well. Some has specialized venom, like snakes and scorpions and spiders, that allow them to catch their prey. Just like predators need special adaptations to catch their prey, prey needs specialized adaptations to avoid being caught. So some of those defense techniques include inflating up real big, being able to flee or fight back, stab the other, or develop a poison for their predators. This here I talked about in class one day is the opalescent nudibranch, and it has a specialized defense strategy in that it is able to so this nudibranchs are known as sea slugs, and they have these gills here that are exposed, which would normally be vulnerability for them, but instead they're able to rub these gills against a sea anemone, take the sting out of the anemone, and migrate them out to the end of their gills where they're able to sting predators or other scary things in the ocean there. Other prey strategies include structural advantages, like having hard body coverings like some insects or turtles, thorns or spines. They're able to break off body parts. And then they also have natural weaponry like antlers. Some, just like predators, also use chemical warfare like blinding ink, poison, offensive smells, and tastes. And as usual, camouflage is also really important for prey. Some are able to change color, others use counter shading, especially in the ocean environment. Some have disruptive or scary patterns, and then of course there's the mimicry piece. Mimicry is mainly a prey technique, and essentially it's copying something. So they use optical or sonic illusions to copy or to look like a predator. Some use schooling or false eyes here, like this moth. Frilled neck and inflation, all different types of mimicry. All right, so there are two types of mimicry, and you don't really need to know the two types, but there's this Batesian mimicry, which is kind of interesting. This is the one where we typically hear about, where a harmless animal has developed adaptations over time to mimic a harmful one, or one that's unpalatable to predators. So in this case, we have the hawk moth larva over here, which is essentially a caterpillar that's mimicking this parrot snake, which happens to be very venomous. So you've got a harmful snake here mimicked by this little caterpillar. Looks pretty close, I think. The other type is Müllerian mimicry, in which two or more unpalatable species, like these two bees here, have grown to resemble each other, where animals or predator species are aware that yellow and black means don't mess with these guys. So there's this yellow jacket, and then there's the cuckoo bee, both harmful. And of course, I couldn't go through a presentation without talking about my main man here, E.O. Wilson. There's Ansar back there. He gives us two kind of rules for coloration. If it's small and beautiful, it's poisonous. If it's beautiful and easy to catch, it's deadly. So avoid those ones. All right, Quick thing number 3 is a little food for thought. Think of a local species. This could be one that maybe you did your endangered species presentation or poster on. And I want you to think of the adaptations that help it to either catch its prey or avoid being eaten, and list those for me. All right, so more on predator-prey relationships. Oftentimes people think that the predator is the only one benefiting and the prey is avoiding the predator, which is often true. It's true that the predator certainly benefits with a meal, but does the prey benefit as well? And if you look in the long term, it sure does. Prey populations benefit because the predators get rid of all those weaker individuals. So only the very most fit are able to survive and reproduce, and so their population, their species, gets stronger and stronger through time. All right, so moving on, another predator-prey interaction often involves coevolution, and that's when two species have lived together and adapted to each other for a long time, so that the changes in one gene pool of one species leads to changes in the gene pool of the other species. And I'm going to highlight these guys down here. You've got the garter snake there with a rough-skinned newt. You might have seen these outside. They've got the bright orange warning coloration on their bellies, and they are definitely poisonous. If humans were to eat them, we would get really sick and possibly even die. But garter snakes really like to eat these rough-skinned newts, and over time the rough-skinned newts have gotten more and more poisonous, and as such those garter snakes, which had this anti-venom or anti-poison lining their guts, were the only ones that would survive. So over time the gene pool drifted of the garter snakes to have more and more of this special stomach lining so that they could eat more and more of the poisonous rough-skinned newts. And the rough-skinned newts continued to get more and more poisonous because those that were the most poisonous survived. All right, and the final species interaction that we're going to talk about is symbiosis. And symbiosis is different than predator-prey or competition because it's when different organisms live in close proximity or in physical contact with one another, and they have kind of this interesting relationship that goes on. There are 3 types of symbiotic relationships. There's parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism, and we're going to talk about all 3. The first one, parasitism, is a form of symbiosis in which one organism benefits and the other is hurt. Yuck. It's like leeches, fleas, ticks, tapeworms. They all benefit from living on us or other animals, and we do not benefit. In fact, we're harmed. Most of the time, the parasite does not kill its host. So, for example, if you get a leech on you, that leech is not going to kill you, but it does benefit, and it benefits if you stay alive. So it's better for the leech if you don't die. There are simple parasites like fleas, ticks, and leeches that move from host to host, and or sometimes they only just have one host during their life. And then there are some that are more complex in their life cycles, like malaria, for example, where it has multiple hosts, and some even have multiple different types of life stages that they move through. Oftentimes we see coevolution happening with parasites and their hosts. One type of coevolution happens or has happened with humans and malaria. Originally, the malaria the parasite would infect the red blood cells, and then in humans, the red blood cells sweep away, are swept away into the spleen every few days and are destroyed. And so the parasite, the malaria, would be destroyed. But over time, the parasite evolved to latch on to the blood vessels with a sticky protein so that they weren't swept into the spleen and destroyed. And then our bodies, over time, evolved in such a way that we recognize the protein malaria, the sticky protein, and we recognize it as a foreign body, and eventually our bodies attacked it, so to speak, and got rid of that sticky protein and the malaria with it. Then, more coevolution here happening, the parasite evolved a way to have different types of proteins so that our body couldn't never catch up and recognize it. Some people call this the evolutionary arms race. I threw this slide in just to creep you out. Parasites are pretty nasty, but we all get them, unfortunately. There are tapeworms and lice and fleas and ticks and all kinds of scary stuff, but at least we don't have this growing off our bodies. Another type of symbiosis is mutualism. And this is a type of symbiosis where both organisms benefit way better than parasitism here. We've got a fungus and an algae coming together to form a lichen where they're both benefiting from their relationship, where the lichen provides the food from photosynthesis and the fungus provides the structure. We've got the clownfish here, which is mutualistic, in which the anemone that the clownfish is swimming in helps to clean its body, and it benefits the anemone as well. And the other form is commensalism, also far better than parasitism. This is a type of symbiosis in which one organism benefits and the other one just isn't harmed or helped. So an example of this is bromeliads up here, a type of epiphyte that's able to live on trees and doesn't harm them. It can't live in the soil. And then we've got some barnacles here living on this, looks like either a gray whale or a humpback whale. The barnacles living on the humpback or gray enjoy catching a ride, and they're able to have a wider range of diet because they're moving, and the whales aren't harmed as a result. All right, I told you I was going to fly through this presentation, so our last and final slide here is this quick think. I want you to summarize why, and remember this was the goal for this presentation, why are population interactions a driving force for natural selection? Answer that question, turn it in by the end of the day, and we're good to go. Don't forget, tomorrow we have a test on Unit 4. Do some review of your notes, do some review of these videos if you want, and certainly look on the book companion site, look at those flashcards, and do your best to study. See you tomorrow.